only Hawaiian on the panel. So I'm going to just be the moderator right now because Dan Wells is on the phone with Brandon Sanderson instead of, he's in the break room. But tell him I'm not the moderator. Okay, we're going to get started. He's probably so good.
We can put him on Dan's on speakerphone. Can you come over here?
In the bathroom?
Alright, thanks, Dan. We'll start without you. Okay.
Alright, so let's go ahead and go through and everyone introduce yourself and say what your most recent book is, and you can make up something. Go.
We don't make stuff up.
I'll start. My name is James Owen. I'm an author and an illustrator. I worked in comics for a number of years doing a series called Star Child. The thing I'm most known for is writing and illustrating a series called The Chronicles of the Imaginarium Geographica. And book 1 is Here There Be Dragons. That's what people know me for best. And the newest thing is the 8th book in the series called The Dragon Knight that I'm just finishing up now. So.
Mayberry. I'm the author of the Joe Ledger Thriller series, the Robin Ruin series, and a bunch of others. My V-Wars Vampire Apocalypse series is in post-production at Netflix, and just the other day we optioned the Joe Ledger series, or optioned Robin Ruin for Alcon Entertainment, and a bunch of other stuff going on. I also write comics for Marvel, IDW, and Dark Horse.
Brandon Sanderson. I primarily write epic fantasy, probably best known for the Stormlight Archive.
I'm Erin Summerall, and I wrote the Clash of Kingdoms trilogy, and that's it.
I'm Tyler Whitesides. I've written, probably most known for the Janitor series, but I have recently been diving into epic fantasy, and my first book is out. It's called The Thousand Deaths of Martyr Ben.
I'm Eric Flint. I've written a lot of books. I'm best known for alternate history, but I've also written lots of different kinds of science fiction, including hard SF, fantasy, some epic fantasy, urban fantasy, pretty much everything.
Dan's microphone because he's not here. I'm Larry Correa. I'm best known for the Monster Hunter International series. My latest book is my epic fantasy series. It's called House of Assassins, sequel to Son of the Black Sword. And also I do alternate history, and I do a comedy series on Audible with Adam Baldwin from Firefly as the narrator. So it's pretty sweet.
This is a really intimidating group of authors that have, I don't know, put together like a zillion books. So I'm glad that we're going to be talking about writing today. Raise your hand if you are an aspiring writer or writer right now. Okay, awesome. Great road to be on. So I want to talk to you guys about, so we're talking about world building in fantasy and science fiction. So I'm just going to throw the question out, and if you want to answer it, you can. Not everyone has to answer it, so feel free to pipe in when you want to. But let's talk about, where do you begin? And I know that's a really broad question because everyone starts with at a different place. But let's talk about your most recent book, and where did you begin with the world building for that most recent book?
I'll jump in on that one. My most recent book is the 7th in a post-apocalyptic series. It takes place essentially 14 years after the events of Night of the Living Dead. I started the world building by having one of the characters, a teenager, in one of these little gated communities, one of the few towns left in the world, looking for a job. He's 15, he has to get a job. So he and his best friend just walk around looking for jobs, and the jobs are the type that would exist in a post-apocalyptic community after a zombie apocalypse. So by them looking for a job, it informs the reader of the world without an info dump and with a little bit of a sense of humor to it as well. And it also shows kind of the inner mechanism for the logic of how I created the series, because everything makes sense. It's a day in the life of ordinary people in a world that is now ordinary to them, even though it's extraordinary to us. So I like the day-in-the-life approach to building the world, and it's also the way in which I sometimes discover big chunks of it.
I'm going to jump on the back of what he just said, because my latest is also a book in a long-running series. And so the world-building aspects are different because it's familiar settings and characters. And in the case of the Dragon Knight, what started it is realizing I had some standalone stories that I'd never gotten to tell. And there was a point some years ago where Simon & Schuster, the publisher, had wanted to do some illustrated books for younger readers. So I came up with some outlines of some stories, and then the editor left. And so the stories just sat there. And then I realized I had a common thread that I could wrap as a framing sequence around these stories. And then I could still tell these stories that for a new reader, this would be introductions to the characters. For people that had read the original books, it would be more backstory to make those characters and settings a little bit richer. And so there was an advantage there that the world building was basically expanding on the world that I'd already built.
So world building is this strange beast for me, in that if you kind of think about it, of the three big aspects of storytelling, even in sci-fi fantasy, world building is kind of the least important. Which is weird, right? We read sci-fi fantasy because of the world building, but generally a story with really awesome characters and a really awesome plot, but kind of mediocre world, is still a really great book. But a story with really great world building and terrible characters is still probably going to be a pretty bad book. So it's this catch-22, right? We all come here because we love dragons, we love spaceships, we love the world building, we love the what-if questions. But at the same time, the thing I love about world building is generally you can be the weirdest in world building of those three kind of groupings. If you try to go really weird with your characters, which you can do, you really have this danger of your characters becoming unsympathetic, unrelatable. It's really easy to make a bad character that's very different from characters you've seen before. It's really hard to make a good character that's very different from what you've seen before. Same thing with plots. It's doable, but if you want to make a really weird, different plot, it's very easy to do a bad one that no one will understand or be able to follow. But with world building, I found that as long as your characters are relatable, that you can make a setting that is just several steps beyond what you assume an audience would accept, and they just will go with it. The Marvel movies have proven this. Like, for years, we sci-fi fantasy fans have loved these really weird, cosmic sort of stories, and, you know, I went to Captain Marvel, and this is a pretty weird world-building story, right? It's got some really out there alien cosmic stuff and things, and everyone just was willing to go along with it because it had a good, relatable character. And so, kind of my philosophy on world building is, let's take what I've seen and push it a few degrees further. I'm always looking for that stretch, that thing I haven't seen my genres doing, and trying to really kind of be bizarre in my world building in ways that people haven't seen before. So, you know, that's my starting point. What haven't I seen?
Oh wait, I actually want to stop you, because I want to jump in. I liked what Brandon said about world building kind of being almost secondary to character, because it truly is. But at some point, character and world have to be cohesive. You have to see the imprint of the world on the character, because we are products of, you know, where we were raised and the people we were raised around. So let's go this way, and I want you to answer, how do you create that cohesiveness in the first few pages of your book, the first chapter? How do you create a character that feels seamless in their world and a part of that, like a product of it?
The best way to start a book is in the first chapter. Whatever else you do, make sure you give the readers one character at least that they find interesting, preferably likable, at least interesting, so they're going to be interested in what happens afterward. Honestly, that's Moses and the prophet. All the rest of it is just commentary. Characters are what pull people through stories. They always are. It's not plot. It's the reason why it's usually a bad idea to start a novel with an action scene. it's because the reader has no vested interest.
Eric just described every one of my books.
And he's gotten away with it too, but I usually don't, because what I find is the readers don't have any vested interest in who, they don't know any of the characters, and they don't care. Yeah, but you're having to face the monsters, right?
Well,
you're cheating.
Well, not always. Sometimes they're just bad guys. No, but character's pivotal, but my thing is, I don't like to think of a book, I don't like to break things into like, this is strictly an action scene, this is strictly a plot scene, this is a world building scene. I think they're all one and the same. Some of the best chances to world build are in your action scenes. Some of your best chances to develop characters are in it tells you a lot about an individual human being as you're stuff.
When writers say, I write character-driven stories, no, really, what defines your character is not personality traits, it's what they do. So that if you don't actually have a plot, you're not really developing characters, you're just wandering around pasting, personality traits on. To go back to your earlier question, I'm lazy, so almost all my world building is based on real history. And it's obvious in the author history, right? But it's true of most of the things, right? For instance, The Course of Empire that I wrote with Kathy Wentworth, it's straight science fiction, but the basic model for it was the Roman conquest of the Greeks. That was what I had in my mind and plotted it all out. And figuring out that conflict of a more advanced civilization being conquered by one that's not as advanced, but is just a whole lot better than military government, and what unfolds from that. And that's generally true of almost everything I write. My first novel is based on different aspects of Southern Bantu history in the 18th century, which just happens to be when I was doing my dissertation.
Okay, I'm going to defend my action scenes, but I already did that. Okay. Here's the thing, guys. It's funny on these Comic-Con or FanX panels, they put 12 writers on a panel to talk about like something that any one of us could teach a 4-hour class on. I'll give you guys an example about the world building here and where it comes from. Like my last series, my last book comes from this series where I set the world kind of loosely based on India. It's a fantasy series, and people are like, why did you do that? Well, how it came about is, originally I had one scene that in my head that this book sprang from. And it was just inspired by a song, a Hans Zimmer song I heard. And I was like, ooh, I had kind of this cool scene pop in my head, and I wrote the scene, right? But then I started thinking, and this is the key to world building, what if this, then what? So I wrote this world required caste systems, okay? So I had a society with real strict caste systems. And so then I started building off of that. Well, what would the world be like? And so I looked at natural history and a great place to borrow from that actually used that. And it just kind of spiraled from there, from the world building. So every time you introduce a thing into your universe, because it's cool and you want to have it, or that character has that cool trait, what if? If you have magical powers and somebody has this magical power in their world, then what does that cause the rest of the world to have? And you've got some masters up here on this doing this, where they will introduce a cool thing in the book that affects those characters, but then they write the rest of the book. The world is based upon that. Eric did 1632. He stuck a Virginia coal mining town into Germany in the year 1632. And then the whole series just spirals off of asking questions of what these people are going to do. Brandon did the same thing with, he had a magic system where people were getting minerals from the environment and doing magical effects based upon the different minerals. And then he built an entire economy off that. Okay, so anytime you introduce a cool fantasy thing for your characters, just ask, then what? And just roll from there.
Tyler's kind of a genius at that. Just, the series that you did. Yes, that Tyler. All right. Because we're talking about these huge, universe-encompassing things, and then we've got janitors and magic, and I was just kind of blown away. You got an entire series out of things that seemed like such a simple combination of ingredients that you found something just magical and profound in. And it was awesome.
Well, thanks. I felt like, especially when I was writing Janitors, I felt like this strange obligation to do it right, because I felt like if I wrote about janitors that had magic power cleaning supplies, I kind of had the corner on that market. Like there wasn't, right? And I felt like all this pressure to get it right, because if I screwed it up and somebody else came along and tried to write magic cleaning supplies, you know, I would have.
You stole it from me. I was working on it.
And so I did feel like an obligation to get it right. And one of the things that I felt like I was able to do with that feeling of obligation is, at every turn, I tried to introduce new magic cleaning supplies, so that it was really like fulfilling for the reader. That they were like, oh, he called it janitors, but like they were never cleaning anything, right? No, I tried to like really like, like I found the thing that was unique about my story, and tried to give them a lot of that.
Hey, Dan Wells, welcome to the panel.
Yeah, Brandon called and said you guys needed me. You guys don't need me up here.
Well, it did say in the list that you were the moderator, so you're like the one person.
It doesn't say that on anything I have. I even looked it up on the website. Sitting here, I'm like, he said I was the moderator. I need to prove him wrong, and I did. It does not say on the website that I'm the moderator.
Well, I took over because I'm
Thank you.
the only Hawaiian on the panel. So, okay, Tyler just brought something up that I thought was interesting, is that he took it, I mean, he has this relatively, it could be a normal world, so we're going back with almost real world, or instead of other world building, real world building, and then you took something unique and kind of expanded on that. So who here has done that in one of the stories that you've written, and like, how many times did you expand on it before you settled on the one way that you wanted to go? Like, talk to me about your elimination process and your whittling down process until you got to that magical thing that you wanted.
Okay, I can talk about this one. I published a couple of years ago a book called Extreme Makeover. Before I was an author, I worked in the beauty industry for 8 years, and that book is my revenge. It is about a beauty company that accidentally creates a hand lotion that can overwrite your DNA and turn you into a copy of somebody else. And I got that idea while I was writing a different book, and I was bored by it, and that's never a good sign when you're bored by your own book. And so I watched, I went out and turned on the TV, and some movie about clones was on, and I thought, well, how can I would love to do a cloning book. I would love to talk about cloning, but what can I combine it with? Like, how can I do cloning in a way no one else has ever done it? And then I was like, I've worked in beauty for 8 years. So, as soon as I had that core idea, that core, science fictional principle, this is a hand lotion that clones you. What I love about that is it spins off 1,000 different ideas and all of these catastrophic ways that can go wrong. And I would talk to people and I would say, hey, what if there was a hand lotion that would turn you into somebody else? And then they would get 1,000 ideas of how that could go wrong. One of the things that I did in that book is I have one organization that needed some muscle. And I'm like, well, what's the best way? If you have access to really easy cloning, what's the best way to get some muscle? And so they make like 20 extra copies of Larry Correa. And that's how they do everything. And he's in the book as Larry. It's great. And so yeah, a lot of that process was expanding, and it expands so much. I'm like, well, what is this? How could it go wrong? If I turn my wife into a supermodel without her permission, what crimes am I technically liable for? And I sat down with a lawyer and pitched all these ideas at him, and he was like, what are you doing? But then you have to stop, and you have to pare that back and say, okay, wait. There's so many stories that could be told around this idea. What's the best one? Which character do I start with? Do I tell the story about the woman who gets turned into a supermodel against her will? Do I tell the story about the cops that are investigating that? Do I tell the story about the people who created the lotion in the first place and are now trying to get away with it? Where do I tell that story? And what is going to be the best use of this idea? Which of these thousands of catastrophes am I going to focus on? And I actually didn't pare down enough. I wrote like a 300,000 word manuscript that I had to cut almost in half by the time it was finally published. So it's hard.
You have to take out a lot of Larry Correas.
I had to take out so many Larry Correas. There were too many in the book, and it just didn't work.
world building within a series is, like my Joe Ledger series, technically it takes place in today's world. So you would think, you know, it's easy enough just to borrow what's there rather than world build. Once you create something within that world that's a little different, you have to play the what then card. So, you know, you create a secret organization that is a rapid response as opposed to a bureaucracy heavy spec ops group. Where does that fit? What happens to the other groups in there? You keep having to find ways to adjust the real world to make it fit. But as the series goes on, you also acquire a lot of characters. Each one of them has a different slant on the world. Each character sees the world a little differently, so you have to rebuild part of the world as they see it in a way that also fits in with the world building that you've done for your other characters. And sometimes you have fun too, because, speaking of Larry, he and I did a novella where his Agent FanX and my Joe Ledger teamed up to do a fight. So when I was doing one of my books, when the heroes were, in the regular series, when the heroes were overpressed, they couldn't handle all the problems that were going out there, I decided that, well, in that world, Monster Hunter International exists, James Rollins' Sigma Force exists, Weston Oaks SEAL Team 666 exists. So I just asked my buddies if I could throw them into the book, and suddenly now my world overlaps with their worlds as well, which makes it a lot of fun because we have a lot of overlap readers. And they start looking for these little hints that these worlds all exist. And it becomes fun for the dedicated reader. The casual reader doesn't know. The dedicated reader starts going on a hunt for all the ways in which these worlds intersect. I actually talked to some of your fans and some of James Rollins fans who have made parallels, you know, connections in books that aren't actually there, but they sound so reasonable that my response is, cool, you figured it out.
So, Jonathan, just let me know when you want to get John Cleaver mixed in there as well.
Yeah, actually, we should talk.
So along this topic, just a principle, one that Dan and I talk a lot about on our podcast. You can go so many places with world building. The fundamental I try to lean back on is world building in service of the story. Meaning not world building for world building's sake, but world building that is going to do something interesting to the characters and the setting, specifically the characters. Meaning if you've got a character who's really into, my wife's reading a book on pigments, on how historically different colors were made. If you have a character that's their background, they were, you know, a pigmenter, a color person. They provided inks and dyes for the painters of the time. Well, you can go really into depth in your world building where the dyes come from. If you're writing The Final Empire and it's about, you know, overthrowing an evil empire and a gang of thieves, they don't care where the dyes come from. Don't spend your time doing that, because that's where world builders disease come from, where you say, well, I can't start my book until I know this. I don't know where the dyes come from in my world. I'm a fraud. No, focus on what's going to be important to the characters in the narrative, because you can spend years, you can spend decades. Tolkien did it. Just world building every detail of your setting.
World builder's disease, I love it.
Yeah, as we say, what Brandon said there, it's an easy trap to fall into, because this world building, a lot of times we'll come up with these really creative ideas, we'll have like our world guide. That's great, save that for the role-playing game, okay? But honestly, because readers don't know, readers don't care. And you'll see this all the time, it's a rookie mistake that we all make at different times, but we'll have these giant info dumps where we just want to tell you the history of this magical kingdom we came up with. But it's completely irrelevant to the story. However, there are some authors that are so good at info dumping that's why people tune into them. But very few of us are. And usually it's like, Jonathan, we call it the world builder's curse. Oh, well, right, yeah. And that is totally true. So.
Yeah, it's, the other problem too is that there are two most dangerous ways an author can procrastinate. It's research and world building. You know, you never get around to writing the actual story. Especially when you write alternate history and you're dealing in, you know, real history, you get a certain amount of nitpickers. You know, we're going to go after because this, that, and the other thing isn't quite right, and so forth. And I have a 5-reader rule, which is if there are only 5 readers in the whole world who are even going to think about it, it's not worth worrying about. And my favorite response is just, what part of our fiction is that? I made all this up, for God's sake. Yeah, the history I didn't make up, but all the rest of it is made up. I do stay away from certain periods, though. I stay away from the Civil War, Napoleonic era, World War II, because you get some really obsessive people who will, I mean, I don't want to worry about how many rows of buttons actually were on the uniform of the Austria. Nice thing about writing a series of the 30 Years War is there is one reenactors group in the United States dedicated to the 30 Years War, and I made sure to make friends with them. They're in Wisconsin. They're it. That's it.
Yeah, never mess up guns or horses. Horse people are very unforgiving. Or ships.
The historical that I just sold is Cold War Berlin, which is so dumb of me to have done because there's people who were still alive who lived through it. And so, like, I sent it to my readers and they're like, no, you got absolutely everything wrong about this. And I know, here's the photos that I took when I was a child. That was a mistake.
Okay, so let me jump to that really quick because I find that historical fantasy is really interesting. So what are the historical facts that you need to pay attention to and keep accurate, and where can you merge into fantasy? Like, what are the rules for that?
I mean, when you're combining history and fantasy, you can't, I've done that 3 different series. You have to keep enough of the real history so the readers feel that it's plausible. That's the main thing. If you throw in stuff that just jars a reader out of the story because they think, oh, that's not possible, that wouldn't happen. And the problem you run into is what in vague books is known as the plywood shield. And where that comes from is David Drake would write stories set in Roman times, and he'd have his soldiers using plywood shields, and he would have readers complaining that he was being anachronistic. And for those of you who know David, he can be very stubborn, and he does not suffer through gladly. So he would keep insisting on putting plywood shields in his, because that's what they were. And finally, Jim Bain said to him, David, it doesn't matter if you're right if a lot of your readers think you're wrong. And so one thing you got to be careful about is if you put something in a novel that's historical that you think a lot of readers are going to think you're wrong about. You have to make clear to them, no, I'm actually right and I know what I'm doing, so shut the hell up.
I did an alternate history series. It's set in the 1930s, but the difference between it and our world started in the 1850s. I introduced magic in the 1850s. So I call it the diversion point. So as far as where you go off of history, everything up until that point was exactly the same as our real history. But then once I had the diversion point, it was fair game. And so anything that changed off of that, I could mess with. And one reason I had this set in the 1930s instead of when it first started is if I got something wrong, or that wasn't the person who was in the office of that time, or that's not where that street was, it doesn't matter. Alter history. A wizard did it. Okay.
Yeah, basically J.J. Abrams' Star Trek. Doesn't matter what you thought you knew, right? It's gonna
Space wizard did it.
Space wizard did it.
One of the there's a lot of tricks you can do. One of the ones I like to do. When I wrote 1634 to Galileo Fair with Venice, we made sure, it mostly takes place in the city of Venice, we made sure that every single location where something important happens was later destroyed. You know, Mussolini raised decades in order to build a railway station, whatever. So nobody can prove us wrong if we screwed up. And the other thing is, because I do like to use real historical characters as much as I want, so what I look for, Prince Ulrich, for instance, is a very important character, was in real history actually murdered at the age of 20. So prove me wrong that his personality was not where I would think that, you know, you try to do things like that. You can't always do it, but it's kind of the same thing Larry did in a different way. If you let enough years go by after the break point, then, you know, you can just shrug it off and say, hey, you know, that's
To some degree. Go ahead, please.
Well, in a way, my books are entirely alternate history because the Imaginarium Geographica is an atlas of maps of imaginary lands that has been kept a secret by the caretakers of it throughout history. But the caretakers were people like Jules Verne and Charles Dickens and Edgar Allan Poe and Shakespeare. And so I could mess with their history in all sorts of ways because my argument was, you know the historical account, but here's the real story. And that works up until you get to the point where caretakers, and three of my principal caretakers are the Inklings, Tolkien, Lewis, and Charles Williams. And those people, the fans of these guys, are very finicky about historical details and how you mess around with their icons. Well, I found out that the librarian at Magdalen College in Oxford is a fan of my work. And I recruited him to become a caretaker and gave him one of the trademark silver pocket watches with the red dragon on it that the caretakers in the stories have. And he got so thrilled by this, when people ask him about historical facts of my books in relation to the real Tolkien, Lewis, and Williams, he says, well, you know the historical account, but James has the real story.
Not everyone can say that they hacked Oxford Library.
You're not an alternate historian, you're a revisionist historian.
It's called secret history, and you don't want to get alternate historians talking on that subject, because it's like listening to an evil theologian.
I did want to jump in though. One thing that I've seen go wrong, because this idea of if your diversion point is far enough back, you can do whatever you want, right? And that's true within, I think, like a Goldilocks zone. Because if your diversion point is way too far back, Earth will change so much by the time we catch up to your story that it's not going to be recognizable. This was one of my problems with Bright, the Netflix movie, where they had, and I know lots of you love it, and that's fine, you're wrong. They had changed history. They had thousands of years of all of these fantasy races and this greater, like, evil being and all of these other things, and yet they still wanted me to believe that Catholic missionaries had settled a city in California and called it Los Angeles. And that was too far for me. There were so many things that were identical that would not have been with 3,000 years of different history.
I can actually tell you, because we researched this, we figured that within 18 months to 24 months of the event in the Ring of Fire that started the 1632 series, that at least within Europe, nobody born would be the same person born in the real world. That there would be, the change would spread that much. And within 5 years, it would probably encompass the entire world. So yeah, he's right. I mean, that kind of thing will annoy me too. If you have the same person being born 50 years later with the same personality, and it's like, oh, come on, give me a break. The one alternate history fantasy I've done with Mr. Lackey and Dave Freer that was set along 1,000 years after the breakpoint, the reason we could get away with this breakpoint was theological. It wasn't some big historical, you know, war or something else. It was pretty subtle. And so we could keep things within what he's calling Goldilocks zone, which is absolutely the right way to look at it. You know, you can't go too far down or else it just stops being plausible.
One of the things playing with history is fun for writers. I talk to a lot of historians when I'm doing, I love working with experts. I was trained as a newspaper guy, so I like talking to experts on things to get as many things right as possible. And often while I'm interviewing these experts, I'll ask for something, like, is there a gap that we don't know anything about that's not documented? What happened to this person? Was there somebody just fell off the historical radar? And characters like that give us a nice entry point to building more into the history without disturbing the existing history. And my novel Assassin's Creed, I had a lot of stuff set during the time of the Crusades, and I didn't want to disrupt any of what happened during the Crusades, but I wanted to build a secret history and secret organization within that. And it turns out there are nice gaps in even something as well documented as the Crusades that allow me to build fiction into existing history. And that became a lot of fun to do, and the historians became my co-conspirators in building in that secret history into reality.
Actually, I was going to bring up your book. So, did you work with historians as first-time readers? I'm just curious to...
No. I have one historian I worked with on that book and found that a couple of my things were completely wrong. Like at that time period, pockets were not a thing. I didn't know that. And it was unlikely for a woman, say, running a small tavern to have a dress the color blue. Apparently that wasn't a thing in that time period because of the availability of that dye and little things like that I'm not a historian.
Back to the dyes.
That's damn dyes. So I did have her, but she specifically did her master's on the Crusades and on and she really understood it. So I had her read that section of it. I tried to get my stuff vetted as often as possible. I did have one thing though that happened. I think Larry's heard this story before. So I was on book tour in England, and my editor was just about to go to press with one of my books and saw what he thought was a mistake in a technical part of one of my books. And this editor plays a lot of first-person shooter games and thought that made him a handgun expert. And I took cops going to a crime scene, and they draw Glock 26s, and there was no mention of them taking the safety off. So he said, oh, Mayberry must have forgot. Let's have them take the safety off, and if there is no safety on the Glock 26. I have heard, when that book came out, and he did it to try to save me embarrassment, I've heard from everyone who's ever heard the name Glock, including the regional sales guy for Glock, invited me to the factory. And, I did my research. I felt very smug about that. And there it is. But if I make a mistake, I'll own it. But that one...
Guns and horses.
I'm telling you.
Guns. I had 4 long-range shooting, rifle shooting scenes in 1632, and the 2 I was worried about, I got it right. The 2 I wasn't worried about, David Weber, as a friend of his, is one of the top marksmen in the Army, I think, and he liked the book, but he said nobody could make those shots. So I just rewrote the scenes for the mass market paperback. So if you read the original, you'll find that I rewrote it.
Wait a minute. Honestly, I'm looking down, I think half of this panel is sent me scenes to check out.
Oh yeah, no.
I'm actually looking, I'm literally half of them.
Is that an invitation? Yeah. Email. Okay.
I don't just send them to him, I send them to David Craig too, because they won't necessarily have the same opinion.
All right, we have 10 minutes left, so I wanted to open it up to questions from the audience. So if you do have a question, and because I'm not good at being fair about picking hands, I usually just go with the tallest person. Oh, so yeah, so I was going to say, yeah, so why don't we just get in line and come, and you're going to line up along the aisle over here.
Remember, as you start to ask questions, that questions start with question words. And we have a huge line and we have 10 minutes, so don't give us a huge comment, just give us a quick question that we can answer.
Speed round.
So, how do you get inspiration and motivation to write a book?
Gotta pay the mortgage.
I used to have a real job and I don't want to have one again.
I think
What he said.
everybody's different in this regard. You've got to figure out what motivates you. Some people work better with carrots, some people work better with sticks. It's kind of about figuring out what makes you want to do the things you want to have done, but not the things in the moment that are easy to do. For me, I found a big breakthrough was recording my daily word count. because I like to see numbers count up on a spreadsheet, just like I like to see my characters level up in a video game. And if I set a goal and then watch the numbers count up, it made me more likely to do things. So find out what works for you specifically, okay?
Yeah, and I bribe myself. Every day when I hit my word count, I put money in my vacation account. So not only am I happy about that, my wife every day asks me if I've hit my word count.
So Eric had mentioned the 5 people test. What is a quick litmus test that any of you uses to know when it's time to stop world building or stop outlining and get in and like write?
Really, in second draft, I don't worry about the first draft. My first drafts are bloated monsters. They're huge. In second draft, I look for anything that the reader absolutely does not need to know in order to get through this, the scene. And I find that there's a lot of stuff that's in there merely because I found it cool, not because they needed to know it. You get used to that process and start carving out. And some of it can be saved for blogs, interviews, you can talk about it, there are anecdotes. But if the reader doesn't need to know it, it shouldn't be in the book. If it doesn't drive the story or something.
I'm going to jump in too, because I haven't actually answered any questions, but anything I call literary potpourri is what comes out. So if it doesn't serve a purpose to build a character or to explain some sort of function of the magic or to explain the system of the world, then it comes out.
Hi, this question is for Brandon. When you wrote Skyward, you based it on a short story you wrote much earlier. Did you find that you had to change any things from the short story in order to make a better novel in Skyward? What were the challenges there?
So I've done this sort of thing a couple of times. When I was specifically working on Skyward, I gave Skyward the freedom it needed to be the story it needed to be, and then I figured I'd fix it in post. It's a screenwriting term. Meaning, in this case, I needed to let this story breathe, and I said it hundreds of years later so that I would have kind of plausible reasons to change things around and whatnot. And then I gave it to readers of the original short story and said, hey, what do you think doesn't fit? What can I work on? But I find in the sort of story I write, if I am focused in an initial narrative on the emotional arcs of the characters and the interweaving of really excellent plots, that's the most important thing, and a lot of the world-building details you can actually revise, you can fix, you can change the fact that that shot, that wasn't possible to be made can be revised later on and these sorts of things. Those things are a lot easier to work around than you think they are. It's a lot harder to rebuild the character's emotional arc from the beginning of the story, so.
All right, you mentioned, well, I don't remember which one, probably a couple of you mentioned don't info dump when we're doing world building. My question is, do you find it easier to do little tidbits here and there of world building as opposed to one of your initial chapters just dedicated to building a world?
I always want to complain about world building. Unless you're David Weber, it's really hard to info dump and make it entertaining. All right. So when you try to get it organic, real bits and pieces. One trick I did in the series is I opened every chapter with a historical quote. It was all for history series, but I took a real historical quote and I changed it a little bit. That way every chapter would have just one little glimpse into the universe. So you kind of unfold it gently, just don't smack them in the face with it.
Yeah, and I would say only unfold it as it's needed for the plot or the characters. That's what I've found, that if you have a scene that is really static, where you're explaining a lot of what is happening in the world, then maybe find a way to make that scene more dynamic, more, where it can actually move, where something can be accomplished besides just letting the audience, the reader know about your world.
When you're using creative license to write alternate history, how do you avoid the accusation of romanticizing historical events?
Don't romanticize them. I mean, as long as you're telling a good story that people like, you can either not get those complaints or ignore them, right? Like, anytime you delve into history, there's always going to be, what he called the plywood shield rule. I have the same thing I call the Tiffany rule. Tiffany was a really common name for girls in the Regency era, but no one would ever believe that, and they would accuse me constantly of making that up, because it sounds like such an 80s name. So, you're always going to get stuff wrong. You're always going to do stuff that people don't like. If there's something in your history that you shouldn't be messing with, either don't mess with it or mess with it the best possible way. Do all of your homework and make sure that you have it right. If you're worried enough about it that you want to stay away from it, either stay away from it or flip off your everyone and just do it the way you want, because I mean that's what we do, right?
And also, romanticizing is often analogous to sanitizing history. Sanitizing history is poor drama, and you know we're in the business of telling dramatic stories. So often we look for a way to peel off the scab of something that happened in history and let it bleed a bit. So we're probably not in danger. Anyone on this panel is not in danger of much of romanticizing things. Probably yes.
Have you ever had a great idea but struggled to get it on paper, and if so, how did you overcome that?
Sometimes ideas have to wait. If you have a great idea, it's worth saving. I mean, my entire Imaginary Geographica series came from one line from a different series that included a mention of a book of maps of imaginary lands owned by H.G. Wells. And it took me probably a decade to actually figure out how to turn that into something. So sometimes they just need to take their own time.
Yeah, I had the idea for a West Virginia coal mining town as a collective protagonist for years. I just couldn't quite figure out what the setting was until, for a completely different book, I started researching the 30 Years' War, and it just occurred to me this would be it. So, you know.
I think play with format too, because sometimes it might not work as a young adult novel or adult novel. Like I just took a young adult novel and I turned it into a picture book.
You mentioned about the starting the act in the inciting incident and not to start it with an action scene. Would you say starting an inciting incident with the first chapter as a political scene would be still just as bad, or would you recommend it's more doable?
Okay, so the thing to remember about any rule that anyone's ever told you about writing, including all of us today, is that we're all wrong. Okay? Anything that you can make work will work. Larry starts all of his books with action scenes. I've read books that start with political scenes. I've read books that start with flashbacks, which is a terrible idea, and yet sometimes it works, right? If you can pull it off, then do it. And so, you know, whatever you can make work. All you're really trying to do in that first chapter is introduce us to the main character, tell us why we like that person, give us a sense of where or when this story takes place, and then tell us whatever cool hook it is. Why do we want to keep reading this? Is it because of the language? Is it because of the setting? Is it because of the magic system? As long as you've got those 4 things in there, you can do it any way you want.
And we just have 1 minute left, so we'll just go quick and let's do one person answer each of these questions discussed. Go.
Hey, so obviously your feedback goes a long way. What happens when it's the opposite of the Tolkien rabbit hole? Like, when do you feel like you need to add more world building into it, where the reader's like, hey, I want more of that? Do you get a sense for that? Or?
That happened to me with Arterben. I had written a bunch of stuff and then I had scrapped it, and when I turned it into my editor, she asked for a little more. So having a good editor or someone else, she said there were holes, and I was able to fill those holes with stuff that I had already created. I had just pulled it out because I wasn't sure if it was important.
Okay, and I actually write fiction, so that was the end. I'm sorry, guys. Thanks for having questions, though, in your mind. Find these other guys at the conference and buy books and have them sign it, and they will answer your questions, maybe.
I'm teaching a class on world building